Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jim Ludis. I am the Executive Director of the Pell Center here at Salve Regina, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to this panel discussion tonight about the effects of climate change in Rhode Island and adaptation. So this morning I got up and about 5 a.m. and I did the morning routine. I let the dog out, took him for a little walk. I turned on the TV, caught about 5 minutes of news, and I can say that there are two things I've really had enough of. The first is the cold, and the second is Justin Bieber. Now, of those two things, I need to say a little bit about one, and it's not the Bieber baby. So when we announced this event, I got a couple of notes from people about whether or not climate change was real. That's not what this conversation tonight is about. I think that the science is pretty overwhelming, and it is a true scientific consensus. We can have a separate conversation. I'll be out in the hallway later if you want to argue about what that means. But the point tonight is to look at what adaptation in Rhode Island is looking like. And one thing that I would just point out to folks, just to sort of nip this in the bud, because it is so cold out, and people say, it's cold. It's been cold since 1998. There is no climate change. Well, this is 140 years of global temperature data. And you will notice that from year to year there's variation. Some years are warmer, some years are cooler. The important thing is the trend line. The trend line is unmistakable. No matter what's happened since 1998, no matter what's happened since 1968, the trend line over the last 140 years, which is the most comprehensive data that the world has, is unmistakable. So that's what we're going to talk about that's all we're going to say about the science tonight. If there's enough public desire for no holds barred conversation about the science of climate change, we'd be happy to do that in the future. But tonight's about adaptation. And to lead the conversation, I want to introduce my colleague, Joe Grady. Joe? Do you know how to get that going?
Yeah, how do I get to my slides?
Do that. Which one, this one?
Yeah, thank you. Great, thanks very much, Jim. And I want to welcome everybody again. Very glad you came out on this cold night to take part in this important and fascinating conversation. We're here to discuss an issue that's really tremendously important for the ocean state and getting more important every year. And we are very lucky to have a terrific panel of guests to speak with us tonight. These are really three of the people who are on the ground leading the way for the state of Rhode Island in terms of how we adapt to the changing environment, the changing climate around us, as depicted in the compelling graph that Jim put up on the screen. So we're very lucky to have them, and I'll introduce them in just a moment. Before getting to our guests, I'll tell you a few words of my own background. So I'm a new senior fellow for public policy at the Pell Center. Very excited to be part of the group at the Pell Center, and looking forward to many conversations in the future with you and the rest of the community about important policy questions facing us and facing the state, facing our nation, as a matter of fact. My own background, I'm a linguist, but for the past 15 years or so, I've spent most of my time looking into how Americans all around the country think about and talk about various public interest issues. Working with colleagues, one of whom is an anthropologist, a cultural anthropologist, another of whom is a pollster and public opinion expert. So the three of us plus other colleagues have done a number of studies of how Americans think about topics from nuclear weapons to global warming to various childhood issues to the arts and so forth. And our focus is on the cultural patterns and the cognitive patterns that either prevent people from getting engaged or lead them to become engaged on an issue. And in particular, I'll just say a few words about the background that I bring to this conversation tonight about global warming, summarizing just a couple of things that we found in several years of different kinds of research. One of the key overwhelming patterns is that Americans, even if they're very concerned, even if they're educated, tend to have a real lack of clarity about global warming and how it works and what it means and what the stakes are. And as Jim says, we're not going to focus on the science tonight, but as background, I'll just mention that it's very clear that most of the people in our communities, even if, as I say, even if they're concerned members of environmental organizations, tend to have a very fuzzy idea of what we mean when we talk about global warming and climate change. So first of all, they don't even know what the story of the causes is in its most basic sense many times. They know it has something to do with pollution and something to do with our industry, but it may not quickly come to mind at all, for example, that a big part of the problem comes from the fact that when we turn on our light switches, the electricity for our lights is being supplied by burning fossil fuels. Mainly coal, and that in turn, as we burn fossil fuels, we are putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which is contributing to a thickening layer, something like a blanket, surrounding the Earth. And we found in our conversations with hundreds of Americans all around the country that when we asked them about what is causing global warming, we got head scratching, we got aerosol cans affecting the ozone layer. We got quite a few, we got references to industry and pollution and cars, but very little sense of the simple picture that we're thickening this layer, we're thickening this blanket of gases. And we found often that once people had this simple picture in their minds, they became immediately much more engaged with the issue because they had a clear picture that they could think in terms of. It was much more interesting and compelling to think about the problem when they kind of had a sense of how it worked. Beyond simply knowing that it has something to do with cars, for example, and the fact that cars are also burning fossil fuels. Likewise, when we talked about the impacts of global warming, there's a lot of talk about polar bears and so forth. Most of this research was several years ago, so the trends have changed somewhat, but I would bet that there's still a considerable lack of clarity out there about the basics that we are referring to when we talk about global warming. So, for example, the fact that this thickening layer traps in heat in the atmosphere, and that one of the main consequences could be a more chaotic and less predictable set of weather patterns, as opposed to simply it feeling warmer on a given day. As Jim said, a lot of people figure that if it's colder, that means there's something wrong with this theory of global warming. And they don't have the sense that the additional heat in the atmosphere may actually create less predictable or certainly very different patterns of weather, different patterns of wind and rainfall, and certainly temperature of the oceans, which we'll hear about tonight. They weren't necessarily clear in the research that we conducted on the fact that the impacts could affect agriculture. That there are a series of very practical and important consequences that we need to be concerned about, and that it is not merely an, quote, an environmentalist's concern. It affects our own property, it affects our agriculture, and it affects us in a variety of very practical and important ways. So part of what we concluded was that as Americans gain more understanding of the basic story here of what's happening in terms of cause and effect, the conversation can become more constructive. And what we're going to talk about tonight is really the very most concrete and most practical side of all this, which is, so it's happening, what do we do about it? And as I mentioned, we have three of the people who are leading the way to answering that question in the state of Rhode Island. I'd like to introduce them now. Our first speaker will be Grover Fugate. Grover is the executive director of Rhode Island's Coastal Resources Management Council, a state agency responsible for preserving, protecting, developing, and restoring coastal areas of Rhode Island. And he speaks frequently to stakeholders all around the state. His agency is involved in formulating plans and policies for communities throughout Rhode Island, advising the governor and the General Assembly on coastal issues, and generally providing guidance to any institutions whose activities affect our coastline and our coastal resources. So truly a leader in this area. Likewise, Pam Rubinoff has been at the University of Rhode Island's Coastal Resources Center for nearly 20 years and leads the center's Climate Change and the Coast program. Her focus is on building resilient coastal communities through technical assistance, policy creation, capacity building, and outreach, working in collaboration with various partners, including local and state officials. And I want to emphasize that part of what we're talking about tonight is the choices that we all have to make collectively. And that means as towns, as cities, as states, and even as a nation, although we'll be focusing on Rhode Island. A guidebook that Pam co-authored is in use by communities both in Rhode Island and internationally. our third speaker, we may actually switch the order, I believe, but Wenley Ferguson is a scientist who has worked at Save the Bay for nearly 25 years on a range of important projects involving assessment and restoration of areas of Narragansett Bay and its watersheds, including salt marshes and coastal buffer areas, among many other areas of focus, and we'll hear more about that from her. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Grover to give our first presentation. It on there?
I think so.
We're going to have plenty of time for discussion. Each presentation will be brief, and then we'll have a lot of time for questions and discussion.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank both of you for having me here tonight. It's a great opportunity to present an issue that's very important to all Rhode Islanders, but not just Rhode Islanders. Anybody that lives near or on the coast should be concerned about this issue anywhere in the world, really. This is not a localized issue by any means. What I'm going to talk tonight about is some of the things that we're looking at in Rhode Island, some of the potential impacts that we're seeing. And then from there, what do we do about it? Because a lot of us are starting to look at scenarios where we have various sea level rise, surge events, you name it, erosion events, those types of things that are associated with climate change. But the important thing is, after we determine what the possibilities are, we have to figure out what we're going to do about it. And that's what we're talking about tonight is adaptation. We don't tend to focus too much at the council level on mitigation, because mitigation is something that what you're trying to do is essentially change the trajectory of where we're headed with climate change. We're more concerned because at the adaptation level, because even if we went to zero emissions today, there's so much inertia in the system that we will see climate change impacts for the next several hundred years, and some scientists are saying out to 1,000 years, based on what we have into the system today. So, excuse me, getting over a cold here. So as I said, this is an issue where we have populations at threat. And here in the United States, as well as most of the world, we love our coasts and we want to be by our coasts. So we can see here that we have erosion problems in quite a number of the states that we're dealing with. And these are erosion problems that are associated with sea level rise. And we also have an expanding coastal population. So this is not a good confluence of both these factors, because more people are moving to the coast, but the coast is threatened and under tremendous pressure right now. And sea level rise impacts, as we look at these, along with some of the other impacts that we're looking at, have a lot of uncertainties associated with them, but they also then start to cause these cascading effects throughout the system. And so there's a lot of issues that actually come out of sea level rise other than just the water or the bathtub level going up. So one of the things that we're concerned about is we will hear, for instance, the International Panel on Climate Change, or as it's referred to as the IPCC, will come out with what's called a global estimate for sea level rise. So based on what they see from thermal expansion of the ocean, if we go back to our 4th grade science class, if we remember that when you heat water, it expands. So as we heat water with the atmosphere, it will expand. That's part of the problem, but the other obviously is the ice sheets both in Antarctica and Greenland. And there's a great deal of uncertainty as to what's going on in those areas right now, but they do contribute to some problems here locally. So we're concerned about relative sea level rise. And relative sea level rise is local. What's happening here? So we look at the international models that are generated. Then what we do is try to adjust those for the local factors that may have additive impacts here. For example, one of the things that potentially is going to add another 2 feet of sea level rise on top of the global estimate for us is the slowing of the density currents. The Gulf Stream, if you want to think of it, is like a river. So it's entrained all this water And as the density starts to lower through the melting glaciers, that current will slow down. And when it slows down, the water that was entrained starts to spread out. And when it spreads out from basically Cape Hatteras up to Boston, it has the potential to add another 2 feet onto the global estimates that we're seeing. So that's really what's important, is how it impacts us here. So this is the sea level rise scenarios that we look at, and they're based on various emission scenarios that are out there. But as you can see, we in the council have started to look at a range of 3 to 5 feet. Now the upper range is looking more like 6 feet by 2100. So that's 3 to 5 feet of additional sea level rise by 2100. Now obviously it's not going to make the jump at 2100. It is going to start to occur prior to that. And based on the latest IPCC report, some of the research that has been coming in on the instability of Greenland in particular, and the adjustments for the North Atlantic Basin, and taking that and regionally modeling that down, NOAA is indicating to us now that that could occur in a much more rapid fashion than 2100. So those would have obviously severe implications for us here in Rhode Island, and I'm going to go through a little bit of that. So we already have world-class policies for coastal hazards. Our coastal program has some of the best policies in the nation. In fact, most states can't even come near us in terms of dealing with coastal hazards. But given the scenarios that we're seeing, it's not enough. If we look at our coastal policies, you can see here there are a series of them that add up to where we've been trying to manage development and keep it out of areas that are prone to severe storms, sea level rise, subsidence, all these types of factors that would threaten development. And by trying to push these out of these areas, we're trying to make for a more resilient community. These are some of the other policies we have, and as I said, a lot of these don't even exist in other states. They don't even think about doing the types of things that we do. So what are we doing? Well, we're looking at planning for 3 threats. We have an erosion threat, we have a sea level rise threat, and we have a storm surge threat. Now, storm surge comes with things like hurricanes or nor'easters, sou'easters, where there's a setup of the sea that is in addition to the high tide levels that we would typically see. And the major ones, obviously, for us are hurricanes. So if we remember back to Sandy, for example, I'll just give you a little bit of a background on this. And we think about Westerly, because Westerly was the hardest hit community in the state during Sandy. Sandy, we have to remember, when Rhode Island was just a tropical storm, not even a hurricane. We had a storm surge in Westerly of about 5 feet above high tide level. And that's what was pushing all the material into Westerly. The 1938 hurricane in that same location had a surge level about 17 to 19 feet. So that will give you what you're potentially looking at. The other aspect of that is that winds are extremely damaging, and winds have implications for the entire state. So again, Tropical Storm Sandy, sustained winds down in Westerly of 58 miles an hour. The 1938 hurricane had sustained winds of 115 to 120 miles an hour. The damage goes a cube off the wind speed. You change that wind speed just a little and you really start to expand your damage envelope. So we got a glancing blow, a brush from a minor event, but we saw the damage that it did. So these are some of the things that we're concerned about and starting to look at. And then we're looking at combinations of these. So if we have a sea level rise of 5 feet and then throw a 38 hurricane event on that, where does that surge penetrate? How far inland does it go? Because this is really going to start to give us a picture as what is exposed and what infrastructure is possibly going to disappear on us in these storms. The other thing that we have to remember as sea level rises, I should say, our shoreline wants to retreat. It wants to move back. That's what shorelines do, and they do it with a combination of sea level rise and storm surge. So when we get these stormy events, that will typically push the shoreline back. So all that material that was in the street of Westerly, that was the system's attempt to start to move back and stabilize itself again. If we look at Napatri, and I can just give you a quick example of that. So what these are is they are a series of depictions of where water lines and the feature was during various periods of time. So the red lines represent the 1939, and the blue lines are the 2004, just to give you a better picture. That's where Napatri was in 1939. That's where Napatri was in 2004. The barrier, it's called a barrier spit, has jumped a full width during that period of time. That's what our shoreline's trying to do. It's trying to move back. If we look at areas, and we're starting to see that we have some very severe erosion areas in certain areas of the state. This is Browning Cottages in South Kingstown. And so what you can see is, in 1972, we had a fairly healthy system. Back in the 90s, it started to degrade on us rapidly, and by 2007, the structures were at threat. That's the day after Sandy. So our shoreline is moving quite rapidly in certain areas on us. The erosion that we're seeing in these areas, we would have anticipated would have taken about 100 years to occur, and it's occurring in less than 20. The other thing that we're having to deal with is a lot of our areas are starting to get flooded from the backside, and this is Atlantic Avenue in Westerly, which has a flooding problem during high tide events and during storms. So we can get conditions where we get a wave setup that pushes the water level higher in the pond, and the pond will actually flood the road from the backside. In addition, when we get surge events, the barrier will breach and we'll get flooding from the front and back in these areas. So Westerly would like to raise the road bed, but when they do that, they have to deal with the stormwater, and unfortunately in dealing with the stormwater, in a situation like this, there's nowhere to push it. So these are some of the problems that we're starting to face. So what does our future look like? Well, if we start to look at erosion and what's occurred, we can start to depict what our shoreline might look like. The red line on this aerial photograph was the shoreline in 1951. The blue line at the edge of the red area there is the shoreline 2012. And the backside of that red area is what we anticipate will go by 2100. And that is without any acceleration in sea level rise. If we have an acceleration in sea level rise, it could go much more rapidly and much further inland. So if we look at that shoreline, and you can see Roy Carpenter's Beach, you can see the red area that depicts the erosion area. And then what we did is we started to throw a sea level rise on this. So the blue area now is a 5-foot sea level rise. So we're getting erosion plus flooding in these areas now, and inundation on a daily basis, twice a day from high tide cycles. Throw a storm surge with sea level rise of 5 feet, and this is where the surge starts to penetrate. So this is a 1938 event with a 5-foot sea level rise. And you can start to see the depth of penetration of these events, but also look at the water depths. In Roy Carpenter's Beach, for instance, that area there, those yellow areas represent 10 feet of water. So obviously that area would be gone. Those structures are not built to withstand an event like this, and they would disappear completely in a storm like this. Another way of depicting it is that. So what we've done is we've taken essentially the shoreline and morphed it back, and then to show the 1938 event on that. So as you can see, we lose quite a bit of our shoreline during this process. So what does our current situation look like? Well, at the Coastal Council, we drive off certain features. And so what we're trying to do is keep people obviously off the active beach and back into the upland areas. So if we look at what we're left with now, that is the inland edge of what we would call the erosional scarp, or where erosion had its inland reach. That is the active beach. that is constantly moving on a daily basis. In behind that is a little bit of a berm or back barrier area. And if we look at the property line, that's where the property line for these houses exists. And they have less than 50 feet between the property line and the erosional scarp now. So within the next set of storms that we will see, many of these structures will start to disappear, and they will have no place to rebuild. So let's take a look at Newport, Ann Street Pier. That's what 3 feet of sea level rise does to Ann Street Pier. Parati Park, 3 feet of sea level, boom. We go up to Providence, Water Place Park, 3 feet of sea level rise, gone. 3 feet of sea level rise, you have to keep in mind, the mid-range projections are saying potentially is reachable by 2050. If we look at Hurricane Sandy, this was the inundation that occurred during Hurricane Sandy. So the areas that are colored here are the areas that flooded. And again, you can see the depth of inundation. The red represents 5 feet. If we throw 5 feet of sea level rise in Newport, that's what it does. You want to take a closer look at some of the other areas. That's 5 feet of sea level rise down in the waterfront area in the north end of the harbor. That's down the south end of the harbor. That's 5 feet of sea level rise in a 1938 surge event, and what sort of surprised me was how the flooding comes in from the backside. So as you can see, the surge pushes right through there. That yellow area is 10 feet of water. The red area is 15 feet of water coming through there. Now, the 1938 event is a known event. It occurred. It's not some theoretical model. It's not something that's out there in some scientist's cookbook. It occurred, and it will occur again. So, again, this is the 1938 surge event with 5 feet of sea level rise, and you can start to see the areas that are impacted. And that's the south end of the harbor, again with 5 feet of sea level rise and the surge. So what are we doing about it? Well, we are starting to push these scenarios for certain areas and start to look what the threat is for infrastructure and for residents. And then what we're trying to do is start to build a plan. But the plan has some problems associated with it in terms of trying to deal with issues that we have as our background issues. As has already been pointed out, this is a very complex scientific problem with a lot of uncertainty in it. And that it makes it very difficult for the public to understand at times. And it makes us difficult for us as managers to try to pin the scientists down to give us better estimates and current time frames so that we can really start to deal with this. The approach has to be beyond the front row. As you can see, these surge areas penetrate quite far inland, and the wind events will certainly cover the entire state. So we need to take a much more comprehensive approach than what we usually typically do in our jurisdiction. So we're trying to forge a partnership with other state agencies and the municipalities to start to deal with this. The legal ramifications are not well known because there are a lot of court cases that are coming out of the southern states, and I'm sure will come out of New Jersey and other areas that had these major events. And some of the interesting things are the courts are starting to attach liability to municipalities and to state agencies where they allow development where perhaps it shouldn't have been. So they're finding that the state agencies and municipalities probably should react a little more responsibly and trying to keep development out of these areas, particularly where a structure has been put in front of another one, knowing that that structure will probably be going, that structure will get taken out, then kneecaps the next one or two structures in behind it. And those are the people that are very upset about this. So the other thing that we're trying to deal with is that you often hear of retreat. And retreat is not a very popular thing, both with the property owners and with the municipalities, because their tax base is it's tied to the front row of development in many of these communities. South Kingstown has indicated time and time again that first row of houses is 20% of their tax base. I would venture to say that a lot of Newport's tax base comes to the first row of houses here. So Municipalities are not enamored with seeing that disappear on them and then trying to make or recoup that throughout the rest of the town. The other major problem that we have, and we've been searching around the US and around the world, is when you look at the solutions that are out there, there really aren't any. People are just starting to come to grips with this. So there's not a toolkit that we can run to and give to the other agencies and municipalities to start to deal with it. There's also a lack of understanding what the long-term consequences are, particularly for municipal decisions. So, should they armor a road and then with sea level rise have to raise it again, maintain it, raise it again, maintain it, raise it again? Or would it be better to look at road relocation? Road relocation may be a much cheaper alternative, but again, this information doesn't exist for the municipalities to try to make these decisions. And then we always have the constant private versus public rights within these areas and the ever-present threat of takings when we try to discourage or prevent development in these areas. So the bottom line is that most of the sea level rise will be, or the adaptation at least to sea level rise in these storms, is going to be an upland adaptation event. And by our current law, upland laws are typically fall within the municipal jurisdiction. Municipalities, however, are the least prepared to deal with this because they don't have the technical expertise to do the analysis for the threat and then try to plan for that in the backside. And the timeframes that we're looking at often extend beyond many of the municipalities' government's political horizons, because we're talking about adjustments that have to occur over a 20 to 50-year period. And of course, with a 2-year election cycle, that doesn't necessarily foster long-range thinking. The tools that we need to adapt for this, I would suggest to you, do not exist today, and we will probably have to develop them. So the bright side is there's a growth industry out there in terms of adaptation. And believe me, if we can figure it out, everybody in the rest of the world is clamoring for this because nobody's figured it out. The Dutch have started to do some things. Obviously, they've been battling the sea for a long time, but they do it at a scale that's unheard of in this country. So if you go to a North Kingstown or a Newport or whatever, the types of projects that the Dutch undertake could not be possibly undertaken by any of those municipalities. So we need to find scale-appropriate solutions. And there's a need to take a holistic approach because it's not going to be just government that's going to do this. We need to do it in partnership with everybody. It needs to be done from the individual level all the way up to the state level, and it needs to involve both government and private industry. So, if we don't do this, what are the consequences? Well, we will be seeing massive losses, and as I just showed you, you just saw what happens to the waterfront district in Newport. We potentially suffer massive losses in some of our biggest economic engines within the country. There will also be significant losses as a result of that from jobs and then property tax base, particularly as the market starts to adjust to the fact that these homes are at threat and people don't want to buy them anymore. And so you're going to see real estate markets collapse. If we look at what the Biggert Waters Act just did, the Biggert Waters Act, by the way, is a series of flood insurance reforms that just went through. And what it did is it took away the subsidies for properties that were built below base flood elevation or were repeat damage properties. So they had to go to full actuarial rate in those areas. People saw their insurance rates in some of these areas climbing up $19,000, $20,000, $30,000 a year for flood insurance. Some of them we've seen as quotes as high as $60,000 a year for flood insurance. That makes the house in most areas of the state unmarketable. And the real estate markets in those areas tanked like that. Those are the types of things that we can start to expect. Then that will force the municipalities to start to adjust and push that back on the rest of the tax base, and there will be all sorts of problems with that. And the financial difficulties then start to cascade up to the state. And the consequences, if we don't start to address this, become more severe, and we have less options to deal with them as time passes. So, in addition to all that, we will start to see litigation occur, and we're already seeing it in Florida. There are people that are starting to sue, for instance, when the town says we can't put a road back anymore because it keeps getting washed out every couple of months. And they've sued and forced the town to maintain the road in perpetuity. So the town is now faced with a decision: do they go in and condemn the houses because it's going to be cheaper to buy them out than it is to maintain the road? Those are the types of things that we're looking at around the nation. So what's the way out? Well, what we're looking at here through the beach SAMP is to start to develop some of this innovation. We're looking at trying to work with the municipalities to figure out what's necessary. What we would like to see ultimately is an innovation center at the university that would act as a repository for this information, act as a repository for the technical expertise, and start to build a long-term database for municipalities to use in other state agencies, to build that toolkit. And that toolkit would not only occur just in policies, but we're going to have to back engineer a lot of places. So what we're looking at also doing is using some of the engineering talent at the university to start to try to figure this out. So this is also going to have a lot of implications across the board. So there are a lot of opportunities here to engage other components of the university, the business community, and all the rest of it, in trying to, again, develop these solutions and then start to market them to other places. So this is some of the stuff that we're working on here. So how does all this start to fit together? So what we're developing now is a set of base maps for the entire state. So what I just showed you from the waterfront district in Newport, we will start to develop for the entire state so that we will have a baseline analysis of what's at threat and then how do we go back and deal with it. We hope to continue on with the education process, both at the general public level, because this has to be a grassroots effort. It's not something that government's going to do top down. Everybody has to be involved in this one. And then we're hoping to develop the policy tools and engineering techniques to start to deal with this. So if you want more information, that's the place to go. And maybe we can talk about some of this a little later. Thank you.
Thank you, Grover. And we're going to move immediately to Wenley Ferguson's remarks, and then Pam Rubinoff's, and then open it up to discussion.
Thank you, Joe. And let me just escape out of here. So I am going to get on the ground and talk a little bit about, sorry about that, how some of the processes that Grover was discussing are affecting today our coastal habitats and some of our coastal infrastructure. I've been working at Save the Bay for a number of years on salt marsh restoration projects, and I've had the fortune to work in Newport for about 15 years on a project that I'm going to highlight a little bit about, because this Gooseneck Cove down off of Ocean Drive was our window into how quickly marshes can change. And most of you are probably familiar with Gooseneck Cove. It used to actually have a neck, which I will show you in a moment. It has a road, Hazard Road, across a marsh, an old road. The tidal restrictions have been around for over 100 years, and the marsh has subsided or sank over those 100 years' time. We estimated from aerial analysis, the marsh, we've lost about 40 acres of marsh in Gooseneck Cove since the 1939 photographs, aerial photographs, which are the earliest images we have. So back in 2009, we did a restoration project where we removed an old dam, which caused some of that water to be stuck on the marsh and exacerbated the subsidence of the marsh. And we installed new culverts, and the city was interested in keeping Hazard Road open, and we couldn't keep it at the size that it once was. So you can see, pre-restoration, it was not in great condition, to say the least. But it was raised to a single lane road, and a new culvert was placed underneath it. Here's the image from 1939, and you can see this is the neck of Gooseneck Cove. It was much narrower. the subsidence has occurred since that time, and it was due to the water sitting on the marsh surface, and the peat, the marsh structure itself, began to sink. We were able to capture some of this marsh subsidence at some sites that we monitored, owned by the City of Newport, right along Gooseneck Cove on the east shore. And you can see in the top slide, 2004, 2010, the exact same site. We had 4 to 7 centimeters, not much, of subsidence of the marsh surface in that 6-year period. It went from vegetated with marsh vegetation. You're still beginning to see a little bit of open water in 2004 to no water, to no vegetation whatsoever. The bottom left photo, the year before it was fully vegetated with salt marsh plants, that in 1 year we lost all the plants, and that was in 2010 when we had a severe drought. And the salinity levels in that section of the marsh, in the peat itself, averaged around 40 parts per thousand, much higher than seawater. And we think the salinity levels caused the marsh to die off, the vegetation. So since 2009, when we fixed the plumbing of the marsh, we got the water to be able to flow out and drain out. We still have been doing what we call adaptive management. And we've been dealing with the small little dams along the old ditches. The upper right picture shows the dams, which you can actually see a little better. These are the old mosquito ditches dug in the 1930s. And when they dug the ditches, they put the spoils on either side of the ditch, causing that linear impoundment or linear dam along the ditches. So we've literally been hand digging these small little ditches, and you can even see them now from Google Earth. You can see some of our little small runnels or creeks down in the bottom right corner. And we've been doing some planting as well. And this seemed all somewhat doable until we looked around and noticed, oh, you didn't show the sea level rise. I just assumed you'd have this. I thought I would just reference it. We looked around and noticed similar conditions at other marshes in the region. And I'm going to go back to this graph, and Pam might have it as well. This shows the rate of sea level rise since 1930. And 2.73 millimeters a year does not seem like a significant amount. However, when you consider since 1990, we have seen a similar increase in sea level rise as we saw a subsidence of the marsh at Gooseneck Cove. So we're seeing that marshes around the region are showing the same signs, or showing the same signs of degradation that we saw at Gooseneck Cove, which had been tidally restricted for over 100 years. It had basically man-made structures preventing the water from draining out, and that caused the water to be stuck on the marsh. These marshes, these are pretty protected marshes, and our concern now is with sea level rise, more water's getting into these marshes, and unfortunately it's not able to drain out, and we're seeing similar levels of degradation. So a couple years ago we began a statewide assessment. We've assessed about 40 marshes around the region, and we're looking at the vegetation communities and also the stability of the peat itself, the building blocks of the salt marsh. And it doesn't look good out there with regards to the condition of our salt marshes. And it's not just in Rhode Island. We're talking to colleagues. We've been on site visits up in Massachusetts, down in Long Island, New Jersey. Similar conditions are being observed. This shallow, impounded water condition we're seeing, it doesn't take long for a marsh, as you saw at Gooseneck Cove, to transition from fully covered with plants, pretty healthy. Our marshes build up over time because of all of the productivity of those marsh plants. When they are stunted, like the upper left picture or the lower right, or when they're waterlogged, the vegetation isn't doing the job of building up the marsh surface. So these marshes aren't keeping up with the rate of sea level rise. And they also become public health threats as well, because these impounded water areas, the water sitting on the marsh is not suitable for some of the salt marsh fish species like mummy chugs that would feed on the mosquito larvae. And that bottom left picture is it's a little ball of mosquito larvae. It's, I don't know how many, we didn't go in and count, but probably 1,000 mosquito larvae in a ball about this big, in a puddle about this big on the marsh. And we're already seeing marsh migration occurring. So the topic that Grover talked about, planning for sea level rise and climate change, we are already seeing the effects of past sea level rise and increased rate of sea level rise on our marshes and coastal habitats today. This is a beautifully buffered marsh along the narrow river, and you can see that vegetation along the bottom. It's seaside goldenrod, high marsh grasses growing underneath a forested area. So just to shift gears a little bit, we're also looking at where our marshes and coastal habitats are coming up against our hardened, our developed shorelines. And as you know, we're a very developed state. We have a lot of coastal development and there's a lot of conflict. But as sea level rises, those marshes are going to want to migrate inland. That intertidal area wants to move inland. And we're already seeing the effects today. Prior to the wonderful maps that Grover showed today of the Wellington, Ave, Kings Park area, we've been working with Sea Grant, where Pam is from. Over the last few years, we have volunteers go out during some of the larger high tide events, and we have them photograph high tide conditions, and as well after storm events. And these are some photos in the right of that Wellington Street area that floods. Not necessarily, the flooding does occur along the, do I have a picture of, I guess I didn't put the picture in. It does flood up and over the seawall at Kings Park, but what happens if you live in that area, you know the water actually comes in via the storm drains. I was in Warren today in a section that's not right on the shoreline, and the salt water is coming in via the storm drain and then getting up onto the street and causing localized flooding. So these images are wonderful tools to educate the community and towns about what's happening today and using them to predict about what 1 foot of sea level rise would look like in the future. Not a irregular basis. The flooding occurs now irregularly. This could be occurring on a daily basis in the future. This is Third Beach in Middletown. And I provided the height as well. NOAA has a wonderful tool on their website where you can go in. If you think the tide seemed higher, since you're very familiar with your waterfront, go onto NOAA's website. Often the tides have been on average higher over the last about 4 years. And of course during storm events, you would predict to have higher tides. This was predicted to be about a 5-foot tide in Newport. At the Newport gauge, it was a 5'7" tide the day this photograph. And what happens in this type of situation is, here's the road that was just reconstructed across a salt marsh back to Gooseneck Cove. In the picture in 2009, the upper right photograph, the construction occurred in January and February and March. I was down there in June and I thought, how did this happen? We haven't had a storm. There's marsh debris, rack line or high tide line is on the road. Did the engineers not get the grades right, or the contractor? Who's responsible for this? Well, went to that NOAA website, and the tide that day was a foot higher than predicted, and it was a beautiful summer day. We had abnormal high tides in late June and July of 2009. It was so bad that I worked with my partners at the city and recommended that they close the road. This road is now closed. It wasn't ever even open for a full year because of coastal flooding. I think we can learn a lot from Hazard Road, that we need to predict what infrastructure we need and try to protect it, and then adapt and realize that we can't protect all of our infrastructure. That's along the north side of the road, and the material on the road itself is salt marsh grasses from a big tide. Ocean Ave is also seeing impacts, of course. Green Bridge area down at the mouth of Gooseneck Cove is a very vulnerable shoreline, and there's been some work done there after Hurricane Sandy. An area just a little bit to the east of Green Bridge, which most people don't think of as vulnerable, has really been identified as quite a vulnerable site. The dune, this dune area here, was really wiped out after Sandy. And we had a blizzard last winter as well, so we had water on Ocean Drive, salt water on Ocean Drive after Sandy. The blizzard caused flooding of Ocean Drive. The dune was protective and prevented smaller storm events from flooding Ocean Drive. Now we don't have that protection, and we're working with the city and the Hazard Beach Association to try to reestablish a small dune on that beach where it once was. And it's amazing how just a small change in elevation can help protect this road, which isn't like some of the sections over by Brenton Point where you have the waves crashing up against the seawall. This had some sort of protection, but it's been wiped out in 1 or 2 storms. Kings Park Beach as well. It's hard to see in this slide, but there's been more erosion along that small little bank right by the boat ramp. And we're working with the city looking at some options. And I'm talking about, these are the baby steps that we're trying to take now to adapt to sea level rise and impacts we're seeing today. Grover was discussing major changes, but I feel like working with communities and neighborhoods and property owners on some of these baby steps provides us with some tools to show how we can adapt. Also, one of the challenges is, how do you have a park with a lawn where you have saltwater inundation on a regular basis? There's actually salt marsh plants growing at Kings Park. There's some blackgrass, which is high marsh grass, and there's some other forbs. There are succulent plants that grow in the marsh at Kings Park, and we're working with the city to try to come up with a most salt-tolerant seed mix for the park. Another little baby step project is over at Easton's Beach, where we've been trying to do some dune grass reestablishment, and little did I know that our small little pilot project would actually hold up quite well during Sandy. And the bottom left picture is an area where we hadn't done the beach grass work, and just to the just adjacent to it, our small little project of 1,000 plants actually held up during the storm. I thought Grover might bring this up. The sea level rise maps also highlight the vulnerability of very key coastal infrastructure, drinking water supplies, sewage treatment plants. This is Easton's pond and the berm along the southern shore of the pond with Easton's Beach in the foreground. It's hard to pick out in that picture, but that was the rack line, the storm surge line, up at the top of the berm. It was just about a foot below the berm. You could see the gulls feeding on the debris right along the edge. And as Grover mentioned, we received a glancing blow, and this is a very vulnerable site for Aquidneck Island. And this is a place where we need to pull together all the tools and all the partners to try to figure out a plan for a sustainable water supply for Aquidneck Island. I just highlighted this project as well, not to say we have the opportunity at Easton's Beach to look at parking lot removal over time, but I think a storm's going to do it for us. We just worked with the town of Barrington on a project to move their parking lot inland, and they were dealing with stormwater runoff and how to improve water quality at their beach, and we were able to get them to, as they repaved their beach and made room for stormwater management, we encouraged them to move the parking lot inland, which they've begun to do, and we're going to be doing some planting adjacent to the area. On the bottom right picture shows that sandy area was all pavement up until about a month or so ago. And all the work that I do, all that marsh digging and marsh planting and monitoring, could not be done without community volunteers and interns and students. We have a wonderful dedicated crew of people who help us get a lot of work done, and partners with many municipalities around the state. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Wenley. And finally, we're going to hear from Pam Rubinoff, and then open it up for questions and discussion.
Is that you?
No, I'm not going. Good evening. Thank you very much. I thought I would do this without any pictures, given that I was coming last after my colleagues who do a fabulous job at this. The good news is that there's a lot of things that you, as community members, decision makers, students, and academics could be doing and are doing. So, and I think that we've talked about some of them, from Wenley's volunteers to Grover, very much highlighting what's going on and this shoreline change special area management plan, how you could engage in that. We'll talk a little bit about that. The other good news is that there really are a lot of different activities going on already. We have, at the University of Rhode Island, where I am, when Grover speaks about working with the university, many of the times that's our group at the university. We try to bring the best science to management, to work with the decision makers, to bring different science from oceanography to geology to help Wenley and her crew do the work that they do. And it's really important because we also play the role of neutral broker. How can we help to have the state, the municipalities, the businesses, and the citizens have the best information to make your decisions? So many of the different activities that are going on at the state include, for instance, the health department. Wenley speaks about the water supply here in Newport. The health department did a full study on the state's water supply and started to look at sea level rise and future precipitation and drought, and start to look at where those areas are vulnerable. They have engaged the city, and the city has been very engaged in that discussion to look at what the water situation and the utilities will look like in the future. To work with some of these wetlands issues, we've partnered with the Coastal Resources Management Council to map all of the wetlands in the state and look at them through 2100 to see what the future could be. The wetlands are really important for wildlife, for fisheries, for all of us to be able to go out and enjoy the bay, the ocean state, what it has to offer. So we've very much been looking at that, and in fact we have our last meeting in 2 weeks with the Aquidneck Island communities. We've gone to all 21 coastal communities with these kinds of maps, and people like yourselves and decision makers, the planners, the land trust have engaged in those discussions to start to look to the future with some maps. Transportation. Wenley showed you a little bit of what was going to happen with some of the local roads. Department of Transportation and statewide planning are looking statewide. We only have, how many times do we have to put money into bonds to manage, to maintain, and to build new roadways? We need to do that with good information so that we're making the right decisions about infrastructure in the future. We can't afford to make bad decisions. We can't afford to put in new roads in the wrong places. We can't afford to upgrade our municipal wastewater treatment plants without this information. So going on that, the state has done, is starting to look at a variety of these things. The beach SAMP is looking at these along the coast and will be an umbrella. Will help to provide a framework for the state policy, state programs, and community action. Today, we are seeing in our municipalities many things going on. As Grover pointed out, the municipalities have to act. They're right there on the edge. North Kingstown has been a pilot. Maybe some of you have heard about some of the activities there. And as Grover points out, it's really important for us to figure out what are the tools. And we can't just sit at a desk and talk about what the tools are. We have to start piloting them and practicing them, both in the wetlands and in the planning board. We've been working with the city of Newport as well to map what sea level rise will look like in the future. We are moving ahead in North Kingstown to incorporate many of these things into their local comprehensive plans. Every community now, by 2016, has to have a plan that incorporates natural hazards and climate change. It's really important. Those plans then, those help us to look at what are our planning decisions and our zoning decisions. It also is essential because of the local roads, transportation improvements at the local level, and capital improvements. The municipalities need that information so that they can make those decisions. The other groups that we're starting to work with a little bit more, and we're very eager to start some of these efforts here in Newport, is the business community. Businesses here in Rhode Island, the waterfront businesses, really are why we all are proud to be part of the Ocean State. So we're going to be working with the waterfront businesses, the maritime trades here in Newport, and we're relying on those experts in their field to help to identify what are the adaptation techniques that need to happen. And then really bring around them state policies, municipal programs, nonprofit efforts to really try to come together, again, through the beach SAMP in many ways and many other programs, to try to identify what are the issues, what are the opportunities, and how can we do work better. So where I want us to go, and I think that this is where our discussion is going, is we are challenged here by these issues that we're dealing with on a daily basis. We're looking at tides that come twice a day. We're looking at hurricanes that we don't know when the next one will be, or the nor'easter the next one will be. But we do know that those damages are getting worse. So the challenge really is to look to the future and to say, given a future that we have now, how can we choose to act differently? And will we need to resist? Will we need to protect our shoreline? In some areas, yes. Will we need to retreat, as Grover was pointing out? In some areas, yes. But in all of these places, we need to become more resilient because we know that that's where we're going in the future. So I'm going to leave us with a proverb by, it's hard to know if this was one of our chiefs. A vision without a plan is just a dream. A plan without a vision is drudgery. But a vision with a plan can change the world. And I think that what we've heard tonight is that we're working on these plans, we're engaging a variety of different stakeholders, experts, and community members to really identify what the vision is and to challenge ourselves to go there, because we can't just keep on doing things the way that we have been, because there's a lot of changes happening. Thank you.
All of our panelists for working so hard to condense what they work on all the time, every day, their life's work, so to speak, into a brief presentation that gives us the highlights of many of the issues that the state is facing, the tough choices we're facing, the opportunities we have. And I'd like to open it up for questions at this point. If we could, let's try to keep the questions themselves brief so that we have a chance for plenty of discussion from different angles. I have a number of questions myself, but I will instead turn it over to you. So I will bring the microphone to you if you'd raise your hand. And speak into the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a brief question for Grover. You said at the beginning of your talk there was inertia in the system. That scared the devil out of me. Can you expand on that and tell me what you meant?
Sure. There are lags in the system. So as we start to pump CO2 into the atmosphere and some of the other greenhouse gases like methane, that causes this greenhouse effect. So it causes long-wave radiation to be reflected back onto the Earth's surface, and it causes this warming. As that occurs, the atmospheric temperature starts to increase. It takes a while for the atmosphere to warm up to the point that it starts to warm the ocean up, and then the deep ocean on top of that. So we've pumped a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere that we haven't seen because of this lagging effect in behind. We haven't seen the full effect of that coming through the system yet. And as we warm our oceans, as I said, that starts to cause an expansion of water in the planet, and then, or seawater, and then we get the problem of sea level rise. The instability of Greenland is another issue that's out there, and it has become very unstable at this point. It went from what we call a dry-based glacier to a wet-based glacier within the last couple of decades. It is, so what happens then is as the surface starts to melt very rapidly on the surface of the glacier, that water has to find its way off the glacier surface. So it goes through what are called moulins, or holes in the surface, down to the base of the glacier. That forms a lubricant, essentially, for the glacier then to start sloughing off into the water. We're also getting feedback loops in terms of as the sea ice starts to melt. Ice reflects about 90% of the energy back to the Earth's atmosphere and out. Seawater absorbs 90% of the sun's energy. So as we start to melt more sea ice, we're losing that reflective surface and gaining more of an absorption surface for that, and that just sets up a feedback loop. So these things are feeding back into the system, and the problem is we just don't know at this point. There are a lot of unknowns out there. There's a whole area called methane hydrates in the Arctic that have the potential to really significantly raise our temperatures here if they start to become active and start to release, because methane is something like 23 times worse than CO2 in terms of its greenhouse impacts. So,
Ben, I think you had a question.
Yeah, hi. I'm Ben Riggs. I live here in Newport, and I live near the Wellington, so this is maybe for Grover, but maybe some other people. During the Sandy storm, the neighbors down from me got a bit flooded. It never got to the top of the seawall. It came in, as Wenley mentioned, through the storm drains. This is the Achilles heel of a large part of Newport. Our storm drains are probably 5 feet below the top of the seawall. So I guess my first question is, does your map that you're showing predicate itself on the seawall or on the level of the storm drains? And when I contacted the city of Newport about the storm drains, why don't we put in a one-way valve like you have a snorkel when you go snorkeling, simply a ball valve to prevent that? They were less than excited and interested about doing it. Is there a technology there that you know of that can be promoted? Is there something that can take that weakness away from the system? Because that would give us back 4 or 5 feet. So I think that's my question.
Yeah, it's interesting because we had a discussion with the city about this the other day. There are things called flapper valves, which you could put on the stormwater outlets that will close during high tide events. The problem that you have is that when we get a rain event and that flapper valve is closed, then there's no outlet for the rainwater to get out. So if you've got a high tide event with a wet storm, you may still get flooding that is occurring, not because of the high tide event now, but because the water's caught in between.
That's the flapper valve at the seawall. I'm talking about up at the street. So that wouldn't happen.
Yeah. These are some of the things that we need to look at. As I said, what we're hoping to do is engage both the ocean engineering and civil engineering school to get some master's and PhD candidates to come and start doing very detailed analysis of these areas and then searching what's out there available and try to propose some cost-effective solutions to try to deal with this. As Wenley pointed out, this is going to be a war of micro adjustments. This isn't going to be one solution is going to fit it and we can walk away. We're going to do a series of these minor adjustments all the way as we go forward, and that's some of the things that we're going to have to look at.
A number of you mentioned the idea of small innovations and that we need, and we need prototypes, and so this idea of valves that work differently for storm drains, that's one example. Could somebody give us one more example of the kind of tool we need to innovate that could help with some aspect of the problem? You have your mic.
So I think this is okay, right?
Yeah.
One of the things, as Grover pointed out, we were meeting with the city last week talking about the opportunity to use green infrastructure on stormwater. So right now, Newport and many of our other communities have a lot of pavement. And so when it rains, we have ponding and flooding, and our storm drains are then not only that there's a lot of sediment in them and can't move the water, but it's really a lot of water in there, and as Grover pointed out, precipitation is increasing, some of the intensity. So what we're looking at is how can we use green infrastructure? How can we take some areas and put more grass, more habitat, more trees? And this is where two efforts, hopefully, the city has moved ahead, and they feel that green infrastructure is a key element to their stormwater management. So we've just put in a grant proposal to work with the city and some of the experts to look at that. And then it's very possible that the landscape architecture studio from URI will be coming to Newport next year to be looking at these kinds of issues as well. So maybe some of that green infrastructure can come together with the gray infrastructure of some of the new types of valves and such, that we could engage some of our engineering students as well as some of our engineering professionals. This isn't only about students, but bringing in the professionals with them to see where we could go with that.
And just to follow up on that point, the City of Newport, we've been partnering with them at Rogers High School on some very low-hanging fruit rain gardens, which is what Pam's talking about, places on the campus itself where the water, instead of going into the storm drain system on Ruggles, can actually infiltrate into the ground. And the city staff, working with, I was working with a teacher, they came in and helped actually install some of these rain gardens that we then planted. And the drainage there is Lily Pond, but the whole goal was to try to deal with the stormwater at the source. And of course the parking area at the school and all of the roof runoff is a major source of runoff into that little watershed. And back to your point, sir, I'm just thinking aloud here, self-regulating tide gates, which is a way that we've been dealing with increasing tidal flushing of historically restricted salt marshes, like down at Galilee, up at the Rhode Island Country Club, Big Mussachuck Creek. It's basically a gate that once the water level goes up too high with a storm tide or a large moon tide, it closes. Now, as Grover brought up, if that event occurs when a rainstorm's occurring, you're still going to have issues. But there are some technologies that are being used, and I think that's an area of innovation that getting some engineering know-how and figuring out different ways, as well as reducing the amount of stormwater coming in, will help lessen some impacts to low-lying areas like Wellington.
Just to make a counterpoint to what you're talking about, you just showed us these wonderful images of how the coastal environment is going to change more than we've seen since the 1930s. And now you're talking about low-hanging fruit that's going to float away. So give us some big picture stuff. What do we have to do, really? Big stuff.
Here you go.
When you look at Newport, for instance, in the waterfront district, I think that is a major engineering task to go back, and how do you go back and re-engineer that so that it can withstand it? Newport waterfront is not something that you're going to walk on and say, let the tide take over. It's something that we're going to have to figure out and go back and back engineer that. And we have to back engineer it, recognizing that we have a historic district and trying to protect those historic values and all the rest of it. So it's going to require some creative thinking on everybody's part. We started to engage our Historic Preservation Commission in this discussion, because I can assure you that the Historic Preservation Commission adaptation did not even exist in their vocabulary when we started to talk to them. So these are things that we're starting to engage. It's going to have to be a transition as we go forward, but certainly places like Newport, we're going to have to go back and back engineer it, and that's going to be a massive event to go do that. And it's going to have to occur over a period of decades in order to achieve that. Hopefully not disappearing on us in storms as we're trying to do that either. So
I think,
Just to put a real fine point on that. So just to put a real fine point on that, so are you talking seawalls? Are you talking Venice? Are you talking? I mean, what? So re-engineering is an awfully big concept. What are you talking about?
when I talk to people about the coastal area, there are two friends that you have: elevation and distance. In this case, it's going to be elevation, I think. That's what we're going to need. We're not going to be putting massive hurricane barriers across a lot of these areas. It's just not going to happen. So we have to go back and try to figure out how do we get these areas up away from the tide events, and then how do we build them so they sustain hurricane events. We've been working with the Insurance Business Institute, which has a facility down in South Carolina that they can generate up to a Category 3 or 5 hurricane within these buildings. So what they do is they do a lot of studies on structural failures of buildings during these wind events, and then they figure out how to go back and re-engineer those structures so they withstand. Those are the types of things that we need to start to do. We don't want to see a massive dislocation of our population after a storm. New Jersey lost in Hurricane Sandy 360,000 homes. We have about 420,000 in Rhode Island, so that's almost our entire housing stock. We don't want to see that occur, because when people lose their homes and there's no other place to go, they move. So you lose your population, you lose your customers, you lose your workers. We don't want that. We want to build a community that can harden itself and start to deal with these things. So.
One last addition to that. I don't think that we have really, we haven't really looked at the 2100. We have communities, so even just using North Kingstown, it's easy because they're across the bay. So working with North Kingstown, after 2 years of really talking about what is the sea level rise, what are some of the potential things happening in Wickford, showing some of these images. At the end of that, we go in there and we're talking to them about some of these hard choices, about what they can put into their comprehensive plan. And you still have people, and we have volunteers, we have a variety of different staff people, and they're saying, why do we need to plan for 20 years from now? And this is a reality. We have our schools that we have to pay for. We have how much money are we paying for the police and fire? So the challenge here is that we're talking about these very real changes, but our behaviors and our political will is not changing so fast. Mm-hmm. And so one of the good things is that sea level rise is going incrementally higher and higher, although it's going quicker. And technology is happening a lot quicker. So we're hoping that, as you're pointing out, maybe there's some other opportunities to look at some of that, but a lot of this isn't about technology. A lot of this is about our political will and our behaviors. And we need to make some hard choices. And I would submit that we need to make them before we have the next Superstorm Sandy. But again, we're not wired to be making these choices now. So,
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting research on the psychology of climate change, thinking and adaptation and so forth. We have, I just want to point out, we've got maybe 7 or 8 minutes left with our guests, so maybe time for 1 or 2 more questions.
Thank you. Perhaps some of that money could come from the military. However, my question is, following up from Jim, in terms of the short-term Band-Aids, that's great, short-term, but is the state actually doing something like buying some of the residential properties at all? Or are they going to wait for that real estate cost to go down?
So, really good question. So, the state has, at this point, doesn't have funds allocated to buy property. However, after many of these events, the state gets some federal money that can be used for mitigation to reduce future loss. And so there are different activities going on right now in terms of elevating and/or, I haven't heard of any buyouts. Actually, that's not true. In Westerly, there were some buyouts along the river. That being said, I think that there's an opportunity now, and probably in the next couple weeks you might hear about this, that Representative Art Handy is working on some legislation on trying to identify what are some of the things that need to happen within the state to adapt better to climate change. And so these kinds of suggestions and support is what he needs. And so I just heard that they're going to be working on a web page so that they could get more public engagement with that. And again, it's about priorities, but our state has always been very good at supporting bonds for different reasons. And for instance, I know that one of the things that they were talking, we support open space bonds, we support transportation bonds. And so some of the discussions have been about, okay, do you get extra credit if you're looking at some of those places that then reduce future loss? And so that's some of the things that they've been talking about. But again, it's incrementally, but I think we're going in the right direction. But it really does need some public support.
The one thing that I think that also needs to occur at the national level, we need to get our heads straight. We're not really there yet. I'm just going to show you something here that's kind of interesting because we were looking at it, trying to figure some stuff out. So this is the New Jersey shoreline here. And after Hurricane Sandy, Congress went and appropriated $60 billion, which is more than we spend on education in the federal budget on this country, but $60 billion to go and deal with the frontal erosion attack problem. So as I said, they're very sensitive. They lost 360,000 homes to a surge event. And so the Corps is now trying to nourish these beaches and push them out 200 to 300 feet offshore, elevating them 26 feet tall, and then driving steel sheet in behind that just in case that system fails. So they're spending billions and billions of dollars on a high cost but low probability event. Okay? Let's look at the backside. The backside is very dense development, potentially going to get flooded. Will get flooded with 2 to 3 feet of sea level rise, and by the way, Annapolis is planning for 2 feet of sea level rise by 2030. It gets worse though. Let's go across that pond into some of the subdivisions that exist in the New Jersey shoreline. To get a little closer, that's what that subdivision looks like. You really want to get a good look at it, that's what it looks like. Put 3 feet of sea level rise in there, they're gone. And when they go, that tax base goes, and I would suggest to you that these are not low-priced homes. there's going to be a significant adjustment in that community in terms of that loss of those neighborhoods. So these are things that we have to get smart about. We have to think not only the frontal attack, which is a low probability event, we have to think sea level rise, which is a high probability event, high cost event. And we haven't got our heads on straight yet. So
we have time for one last question.
To pick up on a comment that you made before, it seems to me that getting municipalities involved is an essential aspect of this, but the state of Rhode Island has got to do that as well. And that's going to cost a lot of money. And it isn't available, it seems to me, at the present time. So my question is, do you have any insight to the frame of mind of our legislators thinking well ahead of the 2-year election cycle, 10, 20, 30 years, planning to take into account these events that are absolutely certain to occur?
Grover? Or wait, you're a state employee.
as Pam has already pointed out, Representative Handy is taking a very progressive look at adaptation and what might be necessary for adaptation. I think it's going to take a little while for our legislature to come to grips with it. And typically, we don't tend to react very well, both at the federal and state level, until we're forced into an emergency situation. I would suggest to you, though, that what we want to try to do is, to the extent that we can, react now. Because when we wait till we get an emergency situation, many of our opportunities or choices have been taken away from us because of our inaction previously. So we're going to try to push as hard as we can to push these initiatives and get the municipalities in the state thinking about this for the long term. I think bond referendums are one thing that we might start to look at in terms of trying to get some serious adaptation efforts going on, is to pass an adaptation bond. Mm-hmm. That's something that I think is going to be necessary in the future to get some money to help everybody, not just the municipalities, but individuals also. There's people that are caught in the Bigger Waters Act and the flood insurance reforms that are going on now. I think it would be very useful if we had low interest or no interest loans or a tax credit available to those people to elevate those structures. For every dollar that we spend on adaptation and mitigation, we save ourselves $4 in disaster relief. So from a fiscal point of view, it just makes sense to help these people get up, get out of the way of these storms so that they're not collecting disaster or insurance money as a result of these problems. I have a bunch of statistics here and charts that I could have showed you, but one of them shows that in these disasters, only 50% approximately of the actual loss is covered through insurance, which means that there's another 50% that's absorbed by individuals. So to the extent that we can prevent those losses, that's what we want to do.
Just to follow up on that as well, one of the things that's we're very eager to see, and legislators respond to us as citizens, and the economics are key. They want to know what are the costs and what are the benefits. What are the costs today and what are the benefits for the future? So in a very short while, the Environmental Protection Agency will be starting a study here on economic benefits and costs of climate change and adaptation. And this was a grant that was competitive across the nation, and we were one of a handful of states that got this. And so again, given that we're the quintessential city-state, we will be looking at a North Kingstown as a as a small laboratory, but then the application of it statewide. And so that will be happening very soon, because every time we go to legislators, every time we go to the Builders Association or the Realtors, the question is always, or the local marina, what's the cost and what's the benefits? So this is where we're hoping that some of this will work. And then, again, I think that it's really important as we engage more of the businesses, because the legislators these days are very interested in the economic climate, rightfully, because this is where we all live. And so we're very eager to work more with different business sectors so that they can start to see what some of the opportunities are and some of the challenges, so that they then could be speaking to some of their legislators.
And just one final comment. If we were sitting here in 2010, CRMC had a climate change policy at that point in time. Sea Grant was working on climate change. But considering all of the planning tools that Pam mentioned and that Grover mentioned, the beach SAMP, the Department of Transportation and Vulnerability Assessment of state and town roads, the Department of Health Assessment of our drinking water supplies, Department of Planning's requirement to have towns have climate change be addressed in comprehensive plans. Those are all new planning tools, and the state is going to be looking at how we're investing, and we have to be part of that process. But I think it's amazing how in a very short period of time we have really gone a long way with regards to the how we are planning for climate change in every sector of municipal and state government. And to follow up on Pam's comments about getting the word out through businesses, through community, and through your own vote, we have to keep, as a state, investing in these green infrastructure bonds and open space and water quality bonds, because that's the funding that's going to enable us to leverage other dollars to deal with this at a scale that it needs to be dealt with. And we have the opportunity to have another green infrastructure bond on the ballot in November if our legislators support it. So there's a real opportunity, something we can do right now.
Can I just add one other thing? This can be a pretty dismal topic and depressing. However, I want to say this. We have developed things in Rhode Island. I mean, we get teased about our size. And climate change, there was a piece of the West Antarctic that broke off that was bigger than Rhode Island, things like that. But we exist at a scale of innovation. We can do things in this state that no other state can do, because we are small enough that we can engage very rapidly and move very rapidly. We're sort of like the special forces of these types of things, where there's small little units that can really react very rapidly. And we've done things in this state that no other state has done. The ocean SAMP in this state is the national model. It is the gold standard for every other state, and nobody has even come close to doing what we did here. So Rhode Island can do things that other states only dream of because of our ability to coordinate and move rapidly here. So we have the ability to show the rest of the nation on what's going on. We just had a group in from Harvard. It's working with 5 major academic institutions, Princeton,
They're here
Harvard, yeah. And they were then commenting about how Rhode Island, through its SAMPs and through its programs, is really sort of leading the way in this. So we have the ability to show people how to do this and how to do it right. And so I want to leave you with that positive note, because we can do this. We can solve it, we can deal with it, and we can move on.
Grover, I want to thank you for wrapping it up on that energizing note, and please join me in thanking our whole panel.